Now, before we go into talk about the important issues regarding G20 and its practical implications, let's define what practical implications are. And on the House of the Government, we would like to define practical implications as actually yielding results in accordance with the goals of G20. And we think that this definition is very clear for both the government side and the opposition side. Now, under this definition, the government side would present three arguments in support of today's motion. The first argument being how G20 is non-binding, how it doesn't assure the member nations to abide by their promises. The second argument about the contradictions in composition that prevent practical implications of G20. The third argument about the nature of conferences and how it makes G20 impractical. And the first argument will be dealt by the first speaker, me. The second and third argument will be dealt by the Deputy Prime Minister, Tae-han, and his speech. Now that we're done with the split and the definition, let's go on to look at an important issue, G20 and its practical implications, how it's non-binding. Now, I have actually 5 points of analysis for the first argument. The first point being how G20 has no enforceable how the members of G20 has no enforceable commitments. The second point of analysis being how there is no such dispute settlement policies that exists in other intergovernmental organizations such as World Trade Organization. The third point of analysis being how there is no incentive for member nations of G20 to contribute to enhance and facilitate G20. The fourth point of analysis being how the absence of permanent secretariat in G20 prevents practical implications. And finally, how all of that leads to no agreements or no treaties being made in G20, preventing it from having practical implications. Now let's go on to look at the first point of analysis being how it does not have any enforceable commitments. Now, in World Trade Organization, when a country wants to change its bindings, like go against the original contract with another country or with another partner country, the country has to go through negotiations, and the country has to compensate for the loss of trade that the partners or the parties that have interest in that contract loses with the breach of the contract that the nation commits. Therefore, in World Trade Organizations, member nations have to compensate other nations for the loss of trade when they want to break a certain contract or when they want to breach a promise or treaty that they originally made. However, in G20, there is no such enforceable commitment. When China makes a promise to reform its currency system to benefit the world economy at the G20, and a year later, they can say that they don't want to. Their agenda has changed, their situation, circumstances have changed. So they don't want to reform their currency system. And there is no punitive measure for China because there is no enforceable commitments within G20 to assure that China abides by its promise made at G20. Now the second point of analysis being how there is no dispute settlement. Now in World Trade Organization, if fellow members are violating trade rules, they will use the multilateral system of settling disputes instead of taking action unilaterally. What this means is that in World Trade Organization, if a country and another country has some kind of disputes in regards to trade, in regards to treaties and contracts, what happens is it's not about this country and another country going against each other and having disputes, but it's about dealing the matter within the organization that is the World Trade Organization. And a lot of parties are involved in this dispute, such as the World Trade Organization Secretariat, the arbitrators, independent experts from other organizations and specialized institutions are involved in settling disputes of two different countries whose interests are in conflict. However, in G20, there is no such dispute settlement that helps two countries or two groups of countries help resolve their differences and opinions. Therefore, we see that in G20, it is harder to reach a compromise, harder to have practical implications on the world economy and domestic economies of their member nations. Now, the third point of analysis is this, about how member nations have no incentive to contribute to the organization, to enhance it and facilitate it. Now, in International Monetary Fund, there is something called contribution-voting share. It means that if a country contributes more financially to the organization that is International Monetary Fund, they have more share of the voting power, meaning that country has this incentive to contribute physically more to the International Monetary Fund. meaning that all the member nations of International Monetary Fund will contribute as much as they can if they want to have more influence in the International Monetary Fund. However, at G20 there is no such system under which more contribution means more voting shares. Therefore, member nations of G20 has no incentive to make G20 a better organization, to enhance it or to facilitate it. Therefore, G20 has no future of becoming a better, a more practical organization. The fourth point of analysis is this: how the absence of permanent secretariat at G20 prevents it from having practical implications. Now, G20 once tried to have permanent secretariat. However, China, Brazil disagreed. On the other hand, Japan and Italy agreed. So in conclusion, there was no establishment of secretariat. What this means is that there is nobody, no party that monitors, that oversees, that sometimes steps in to gather people, to gather different opinions, and sometimes steps in to give new ideas. Therefore, we see that these member nations have no supervising body under which they can interact with, they can compromise, they can make compromises, under which they can form declarations, or whether it be declarations or treaties or agreements. Now, all of these factors that make G20 impractical leads to my final point of analysis, and how in contrast to World Trade Organization, G20 has not made any agreements or treaties so far. World Trade Organization so far oversees 60 agreements, and two prominent ones are, first, the Treaty of Agriculture, and the second one, Treaty of Intellectual Property. And we see that these two treaties play a key role in defining the terms of intellectual property and defining how the agricultural exports of different countries are going to be mediated. And we see that these agreements and treaties are not going to be made in G20 because it's non-binding, and the countries are not going to abide by their promises. So in conclusion, we see that G20 has no practical implication on the world economy nor on the domestic level. Thank you.
Speaker has